The first thing I noticed about Cara Lawson was that she knocked on my door at 11 on a Tuesday night holding a casserole dish with oven mitts still on her hands, and introduced herself by saying she had made too much lasagna and her ex-boyfriend's name was Derek and Derek did not deserve the leftovers. I was standing in my doorway in sweatpants and socks, holding a book I had not actually been reading, and she was already setting the dish on my entry table like she had delivered food to strangers every week of her adult life. I said, "I'm sorry, I don't think we've met." She said, "Third floor, apartment 3C, you're 3A, you held the elevator for me once in February and I've been meaning to thank you ever since." Then she looked at me very seriously. "The lasagna is the thank you." Her name was Cara. She was 29. She taught high school English, which explained why she talked like every sentence had been lightly edited before leaving her mouth. She had dark curly hair she was always pushing off her forehead, a laugh that came out of nowhere and surprised even her, and she was apparently in the habit of distributing emotional support carbohydrates to people who held elevators. My name is Joel Garrett. I was 31, a structural engineer with a job that paid well and a personal life I kept meaning to organize. My apartment was neat in the way bachelor apartments become neat when nobody visits enough to mess them up. I had too many books, one decent couch, and a habit of eating the same 4 meals because cooking for one required a kind of optimism I hadn't located yet. That was 8 months before the night that changed everything. In those 8 months, Cara and I became friends the way neighbors sometimes do in apartment buildings, slowly then all at once. It started with the lasagna. Then I saw her at the mailboxes a week later and she reported that Derek had texted to ask if she still had his guitar. She said she did not have his guitar. She had never been within 10 feet of a guitar. This was apparently the third thing Derek did not own that he had asked to reclaim. I offered to help her draft a reply so annoying he would stop texting. She said yes immediately. We sat on her floor for 40 minutes with wine and wrote something so bureaucratically formal that I was proud of it from a professional standpoint. After that, we were just in each other's orbit, not by design. The building made it easy. We shared the same laundry room, the same elevator, the same narrow hallway that smelled like somebody's pine cleaner on Thursday nights. She started knocking when she had extra food. I started texting when I was making coffee and asking if she wanted any. She left library books outside my door with sticky notes that said things like, "Thought you'd hate this, but in a productive way," and she was right every time. People are easy to lie to, yourself included, so I told myself this was just what friendly neighbors did. I told myself Cara and I had a pleasant, uncomplicated arrangement. I told myself that the particular way she laughed when I said something she hadn't expected had nothing to do with why I started saying unexpected things more often. I was 31 years old. I knew better. I also did nothing about it for 8 months because knowing better and doing better are, as it turns out, two entirely separate skill sets. The night of the party was a Friday in October. It was a birthday thing for a woman named Priya who lived on the second floor, and had decided her 30th birthday required a themed event involving costumes and extremely strong cocktails, and a playlist loud enough to rattle the picture frames in 2B. I know this because the man in 2B knocked on Priya's door at midnight and told her so, and Priya apologized with such genuine warmth that he ended up staying and having a drink. Cara knocked on my door at 8:15 in a green dress and said, "Are you going to Priya's thing? I need a buffer or I'll end up talking to someone's boyfriend about their podcast for 40 minutes. I had been planning to stay in. I said yes anyway. The thing about Cara at a party was that she was good at it in a way that looked effortless from the outside, but I had started to notice wasn't. She moved through rooms like she was genuinely happy to be wherever she landed. She asked people questions they hadn't thought to answer before. She laughed at jokes she didn't find funny without looking like she was performing, which is actually very difficult to pull off. But around 10 o'clock something shifted, not dramatically. She got quieter. She smiled the same way but held it a second too long in between. She kept getting her own refills instead of letting conversation carry her to the drinks table with someone else. I drifted closer without announcing it. The party had gotten loud enough that you had to lean in to hear anything. I said, "How are you doing?" She looked at me. "I'm great." She was not great. Her eyes had that particular quality I had started recognizing, the flatness that arrived when something was taking up all the space behind her face and she was being polite about it. "You don't have to be great," I said. She blinked at me. "Joel." "Yeah." "Stop being perceptive, I'm trying to have fun." "You can have fun and also not be great." She looked at me for a beat too long then laughed and it was almost the real one. "Derek got engaged," she said. I found out this afternoon, which is fine. Obviously it's fine. We broke up a year ago and I'm completely fine. She lifted her drink. I'm having a drink at a birthday party. This is what fine looks like. Derek and Kara had dated for 3 years. Whatever fine looked like, it was not this. I got her water. I stayed nearby. I am not sure when I became the person who did those things automatically, but I was and I did. By 11:30, Kara had accepted 2 more drinks from people who kept pressing them on her, because that is what people at parties do when the host has made it socially impossible to say no. By midnight, she was sitting on Priya's kitchen counter talking to me with the careful precision of someone who understood she was past the point of being reasonable, and was compensating by trying to sound very reasonable. She said, the thing about Derek is, she held up one finger, he plays guitar badly and now someone wants to marry that, which means someone chose that on purpose. Some people like bad guitar, I said. Do they? She looked genuinely uncertain. Or do they just tolerate it because the person holding the guitar is charming in other respects and you convince yourself that the bad guitar is actually endearing and then 5 years later you realize it was just bad guitar the whole time? She looked at me very seriously. Was that about Derek or was that about me? What do you think? She pointed the finger at me. I think you're doing the thing where you ask questions instead of answering them, and I think I'm too tired to be annoyed about it right now. She slid off the counter with more confidence than the situation called for and caught the edge of the counter with one hand. I need air. I said, I'll take you home. She said, I don't need taking home. I said, I know. She thought about that. Okay, fine. The hallway was quieter. She walked steadily, which surprised me, and then she turned toward the stairwell instead of the elevator, which did not. Kara, stairs are faster. The elevator is literally 10 feet away. She looked at the elevator, then at the stairs, then at me. Fine, but I want you to know that I could have done the stairs. I believe you. I did not believe her. In the elevator, she leaned against the wall with her head tipped back and stared at the ceiling. The building's elevator was old and slow and smelled like metal and someone's dryer sheets. She said, do you think people know when they're making the wrong choice? Do you think somewhere in their brain there's a little signal and they just ignore it? I thought about that. I think sometimes, other times I think you can't know until you know. That's very noncommittal. I'm an engineer, I hedge when I don't have the data. She smiled at the ceiling. I like that you're an engineer, you take things seriously, like you actually think before you talk. She paused. Unlike Derek, who talked and then thought about it later and decided the talking had been correct even when it hadn't. That sounds exhausting. It was a very fatiguing 3 years, she said solemnly. The elevator stopped, I got the door. She walked out and then she walked to my door instead of hers. I said, that's 3A. She looked at the number, then at her own door 6 feet down the hall, then at me. Right, yes. She moved toward 3C and found her key on the second try. The lock was stuck on cold nights, the building was old, and I had mentioned twice to the super that 3C's deadbolt needed attention. He had agreed both times and done nothing, which is the relationship most building supers have with non-emergency repairs. She fought the key. I said, do you want me to? I have it. The key did not turn. She exhaled once through her nose, not a sigh exactly, more like a woman recalculating her options in real time. Okay, she said. I took the key. The trick was lifting the handle slightly while turning, something she probably knew when she was sober. It opened on the first try. She took the key back, stood in the doorway, looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read in the dim hallway light, something between tired and careful. Thank you, she said. Get some water before you sleep. She nodded. In Kara. She looked at me. Derek, making a different mistake doesn't change anything that was right about you. She stood very still for a second, then she said, that's the nicest thing anyone has said to me all week. Her voice was quiet, which is either sweet or a little bit sad. Maybe both. She looked at me for one beat too long, then she looked at the floor, then she stepped back into her apartment. Good night, Joel, she said. Good night. The door closed. I went back to my apartment, drank a glass of water I didn't need, stood at my kitchen window for 10 minutes staring at the parking lot thinking about nothing in particular, and went to bed. At 2 in the morning my phone buzzed. It was Kara. Thank you for tonight, she had typed it and nothing else. I stared at the screen for long enough that it dimmed. I typed back anytime. Then I put the phone face down and told myself to go to sleep, which worked eventually, in the way that telling yourself to sleep works when something is sitting quietly in your chest making itself comfortable. I had a meeting at 9 the next morning, so I was up at 7 making coffee and trying to remember whether I'd packed my laptop bag the night before or left it at the office. The answer was the office, which meant I had 15 minutes more than I thought I did and no particular reason to hurry. I heard her knock at 7:42. Not loud, 3 knocks, careful, the way people knock when they're not entirely sure they should be knocking. I opened the door. Kara was standing in the hallway in jeans and a soft gray sweater and clean hair and the particular expression of a person who has rehearsed something and is now second-guessing whether the rehearsal was adequate. She was holding 2 cups from the coffee place 3 blocks down. The good one, the one that opened at 7 and cost more than it should and was worth it. She held one out. I said you didn't have to do that. She said I know, then can I come in for a second? I moved out of the doorway. She stepped inside, set her own cup on my kitchen counter, and held hers with both hands in the way she did when she was about to say something she wasn't fully ready to say. I had seen her do this before. It involved a slight forward tilt of the shoulders and a look that was aimed about 6 inches below wherever she actually wanted to look. I said, Kara. I remember everything from last night, she said. Okay. I wasn't as drunk as I maybe seemed. I thought about the elevator, the stairs she had considered, the lock, I know. She looked up at that, you know. I figured you were past the comfortable point but not past the aware point. You were just tired and sad and letting the drinks do a little of the heavy lifting. She stared at me for a long second, you noticed that. You're not that hard to read when you want to be read. She exhaled and looked at her coffee cup. I came to say thank you for real, not the text, in person. She lifted her eyes, for the water comment and the other thing you said. The Derek thing. Yes, she swallowed. People don't say things like that unless they mean them, not at midnight in a hallway to someone who is clearly not having a great night. You could have just said good night and let it be a good neighbor moment. You didn't. I said I didn't want to. Something in her face shifted, careful and open at the same time. She said, Joel, can I ask you something? Yeah. And you'll give me an honest answer, not an engineered one where you hedge because you don't have the data. That surprised a small laugh out of me. I'll try. She set her coffee down on the counter beside mine, 2 paper cups side by side. She looked at them for a moment, then looked at me with the directness she used when she was done circling something. Did you take me home last night because you're a good neighbor, she said, or was there another reason? The question sat in the kitchen air between us and did not offer any exits. I had 2 choices. I could say something reasonable and small that would let us both step back and file this away as a nice morning and a good cup of coffee between neighbors. I was good at reasonable. I spent my days calculating load tolerances and structural margins. I knew how to find the safe middle. But Kara was looking at me like she had already done the math herself and was waiting to see if my answer matched. I said there was another reason. She didn't say anything. I said I've been paying more attention than a good neighbor would for a while now. I told myself it didn't mean anything specific because it was easier than figuring out what to do if it did. Her expression didn't move, but her hands tightened on the counter edge. How long is a while? She asked. A while. Joel. Since the lasagna, I said. Maybe before, the lasagna was when I stopped pretending I hadn't noticed. She looked at me for a long moment. Outside, the building made its morning sounds, pipes in the walls, somebody's shower on the floor above, a door opening and closing down the hallway. Then she said, you held the elevator in February. Yeah. And I thought you were going to say something then because you looked at me the same way you look at me sometimes, and then you just said good evening and got off on 3. I felt that land in a specific place. You noticed that. I have been noticing things for 8 months, Joel. Her voice was quieter now but clearer. And I convinced myself the noticing was one-sided because you are very calm and very composed and you never gave me anything definitive to hold on to. So I told myself I was projecting. She paused. I am very good at convincing myself of things I want to believe. I said, so am I. She looked at me. I said, I convinced myself that being your friend was enough because it was better than risking it. You were the best part of my week most weeks, and I didn't want to be the person who broke that by wanting more than I was supposed to want. The word supposed hung there. Kara pushed off the counter and crossed the 3 feet of kitchen between us, not fast, not dramatically, just direct, the way she did everything when she made up her mind. She stopped close enough that I could see the particular line between her eyebrows she got when something mattered. Who decided what you were supposed to want? She asked. I had no good answer for that. She said, because I've been living 6 feet down the hall from you for 8 months thinking about that elevator, and the way you always have coffee ready when you text to ask if I want some, and how you drafted a bureaucratically formal letter to my ex at 10 o'clock at night without making me feel pathetic about it. She tilted her head slightly. And last night you stood in a parking lot elevator with me at midnight and said something true and kind when you could have just said good night and been done with it. I said, Kara, don't say my name like you're about to be careful. I'm not being careful. Good, her chin lifted, because I remember everything, including the part where I wanted to say something in the elevator and didn't because I wasn't sure and I was tired and the timing was wrong. She met my eyes. The timing is less wrong now. I took one step closer to the remaining distance between us and said, can I ask you something back? Yes. Last night when you asked me about people knowing when they're making the wrong choice, were you talking about Derek? She was quiet for a moment, then not entirely. What were you talking about, the other part? She smiled then, small and real and a little rueful. Standing 6 feet down the hall from someone and pretending the door between us was the important part. I kissed her. Not dramatically, not after a long pause where we stared at each other and the universe aligned itself for the occasion. Just she was standing in my kitchen with 2 coffee cups on the counter and her eyes were clear and she was done pretending the door was the important part, and so was I. She kissed me back with both hands on my shirt, not grabbing, just holding, like she was checking that this was real and solid. When we stepped back, she kept her forehead near mine for a second, her eyes were closed. She said, okay. I said, okay. She opened her eyes. I'm just making sure I'm not doing the thing where I'm still a little emotionally rattled from the Derek news and my brain is making a compensatory decision. I said, are you? She thought about it properly, not quickly, not as a performance. She actually considered it, which was so thoroughly Kara that I nearly smiled. No, she said, this is not about Derek. Her hands loosened on my shirt but didn't let go. Derek has nothing to do with this. This is about the elevator in February and the lasagna and the letter and 8 months of pretending the obvious thing wasn't happening. I said, for what it's worth, same. The whole 8 months, including the elevator in February. She made a sound halfway between a laugh and a sigh and pressed her forehead properly against mine. You could have said something in February, Joel. You could have not held the oven mitts on the entire walk from your kitchen to my door. I was nervous. I know. She laughed for real then, the one that surprised her, and the kitchen got warmer. We drank the coffee she'd brought while it was still hot, which barely qualified as a miracle given the previous 15 minutes. She sat on the counter in the way she apparently sat on all available counters, and I leaned against the opposite one, and we talked the way people talk when they've just changed the shape of a relationship and need a minute to get used to where the new edges are. She said, I should tell you something. I said, okay. I'm terrible in the mornings, not rude terrible, just slow. I need about 45 minutes and 2 coffees before I'm fully a person. She looked at me. You should know that going in. I said, I get up at 7. She said, that is genuinely alarming. I said, I go to bed at 10:30 most nights. She stared at me. You are a different species. You can come over for the second coffee before the 45 minutes are up. She considered that. That is a very patient offer. I'm an engineer, patient is sort of the baseline. She smiled into her cup, then looked up. I also have a stack of ungraded essays in my kitchen that I have been ignoring for 4 days, and I'm going to need to grade them this weekend, and I become entirely insufferable when I'm grading because every bad comma splice personally offends me. I said, I have reports to write on Sunday afternoons that make me rearrange the furniture instead of starting them. That explains why you moved the couch. You noticed that. Joel, I have been noticing things for 8 months, I've told you this. We sat with that for a moment, the specific warm absurdity of finding out someone had been paying the same quiet attention you had. Then she said, what do we do about the neighbor thing? What about it? It's either the best part of this or the part that makes it complicated, or both. I said, we've been neighbors for 8 months and we've already survived the lasagna and the elevator and Derek and the bad deadbolt. I think we can survive knowing each other 6 feet down the hall. That is a structurally sound argument. I'm glad something is. She slid off the counter and picked up both cups, both empty now, and dropped them in my recycling bin with the ease of someone who had been in this kitchen enough times to know where the recycling bin was, which she had. She absolutely had. I had been pretending not to notice that too. She stopped near the door. Joel. Yeah. She turned around. There was something in her face that was new and familiar all at once, the way she looked when she had written down a thought and found it was better than she expected. I'm glad you didn't say good night and leave it at a good neighbor moment. So am I. She opened the door, then paused, looked back at me with one hand on the frame. For the record, she said, the lasagna was also because I wanted to see what your apartment looked like. I stared at her, the thank you was a pretext. I made too much lasagna, both things were true. You've been in here 40 times since then. I know, she smiled. I had very thorough reconnaissance by month 2. She walked out, 6 feet down the hall, her door opened and closed with the small click of a deadbolt that worked now because I had finally gotten the super to fix it in September. I stood in my kitchen. Then I picked up my phone and texted her. For the record, I held the elevator in February on purpose. I saw you coming and pressed door open. 40 seconds passed. Then I know. Then I also know you went back to the mailboxes the next day. You'd already gotten your mail. I put the phone down. Then I picked it up again and typed, okay, so we've both been ridiculous. Her reply came back in about 10 seconds, completely ridiculous, dinner tonight. I texted back, yes, 6:30, I'll cook. She sent back, 4 meals. I said, pick one. She sent a list, it had exactly 4 items on it, they were all correct. I was still smiling about that when I left for work. The first dinner was at my place, pasta, nothing complicated, the kind of meal that gives you something to do with your hands while you figure out how to be new people inside a relationship that is actually 8 months old. Kara showed up with wine she had already selected and strong opinions about whether garlic belonged in the sauce at the beginning or the end. It belonged at the beginning. For the record, she was right, I told her so, and she was pleased about it in a way she tried not to show and failed. We ate at my small table and talked until the food was cold and neither of us noticed. The thing about knowing someone first as a friend is that when you become something else, you skip a certain kind of performance. There was no first date conversation about jobs and hometowns and whether you were a morning person. We already knew the answers. We knew the bad ones too. She knew I avoided phone calls the way some people avoid spiders. I knew she cried at documentaries about animals and then felt embarrassed about it afterward and denied it. What we didn't know yet was the new shape of the space between us. She said, is this weird for you? I said, is it weird for you? She gave me a look, that's the hedge. No, I said, it's not weird, it's the opposite of weird, which is maybe the part I'm still getting used to. She turned her wine glass slowly. Me too, I keep waiting for it to feel strange and it doesn't. She looked at me, which is either a very good sign or evidence that we should have done this months ago and I'm going to be mildly annoyed about the lost time for a while. How mildly? Moderately, I'll manage it. I said we can make up for it. She looked at me over her glass, can we? We live 6 feet apart, we have a significant logistical advantage. She laughed, the most unromantic romantic argument I have ever heard. I'll work on it. You don't have to work on it. She reached across the table and touched the back of my hand, light and deliberate. I like your arguments, even the structural ones. I turned my hand over, she let me hold hers. Outside, the building made its evening sounds, someone on the floor above running a bath, the elevator groaning its way to 4, a door somewhere closing soft. She said, I'm still a little mad at Derek. That's fair. Not because he got engaged, because I spent 3 years adjusting myself to fit what he thought I should be, and I was so busy fitting that I missed 8 months of this. She gestured with her free hand at the general space between us. I said, you didn't miss it, you were here for all of it. I was not taking notes. You absolutely were, you knew I went back to the mailboxes. She pointed at me, that's a fair point. Then she settled back and looked at me properly. I want to do this right. So do I. Which for me means not rushing. She met my eyes. Not because I'm unsure, because I want to actually be here for it, not just let it happen around me while I'm adjusting. I understood that. I also understood that it took something to say it, to be that direct about needing to go carefully without making it sound like doubt. I said, we'll do it right. She held my hand a little tighter. Good. We did the dishes together after, which felt unreasonably domestic for a first official dinner and entirely comfortable anyway, because we had been moving around each other's spaces for 8 months and we already knew whose shoulder bumped into whose at a kitchen sink. At the door, she pulled on her jacket and looked up at me. Third floor 3A, she said. Third floor 3C, I said. She smiled and went 6 feet down the hall and inside. I stood in my doorway for a moment longer than necessary. Then I went back to my kitchen, looked at the 2 glasses on the counter, and started thinking about what was in the refrigerator for next week. The weeks after were quiet in the best way. Quiet does not mean small. It means we built it in layers, mornings with coffee before she went to school, evenings when she came over to grade papers at my table and I sat across from her doing reports we both put off until the last possible moment. She left a red pen in my couch cushions. I started stocking the tea she liked because she came over enough in the evenings that it made practical sense, which was what I told myself, and she had raised one eyebrow when she saw the box in the cabinet and not said anything, which was how I knew she understood. We had a first argument 3 weeks in, over something small that was not actually about the small thing but about the fact that I had not told her I was having a difficult week at work and she had been around every day and hadn't known. She said she wanted to be the person I told things to when things were difficult. I said I was used to handling it internally. She said she knew, and that was exactly the part that frustrated her. She was right. I apologized without qualifying it. She accepted it without performing forgiveness. We ate Thai food and watched something we both fell asleep in front of, and that was that. It was the first fight we had as whatever we were, and I knew during it and after it that she was the kind of person I wanted to be wrong in front of, which is a specific and valuable thing. Her mother asked when Kara mentioned me in a phone call, is he the neighbor? Kara said yes. Her mother said, I thought so, you've mentioned him too many times for him to be just the neighbor. Kara told me this a week later like it was funny. I think she told me because it was true and she wanted to say it out loud without making a whole moment of it. Her students asked, apparently, if she had a boyfriend. She had told them no, which was technically still accurate at the time, and then changed her answer 2 weeks later in a form that did not invite follow-up questions. One of them told her he sounded like a main character. She informed him that was not a useful piece of analysis. He said every story needs a main character, and she admitted later to me that it was possibly the most irritating, insightful thing a 16-year-old had ever said to her. By November, I had stopped pretending the 4 meals were a permanent menu and was attempting new ones because she came over often enough that variety seemed respectful. She had strong opinions about most things I attempted and they were usually correct, and she shared them with enough kindness that I didn't mind. I started texting her from the grocery store on Saturdays. She started texting back from hers, and at some point our grocery lists began to overlap without either of us formally planning that. One Saturday morning she was sitting on my counter while I made eggs and she said, I need to tell you something. I said, okay. She said, I was not actually out of lasagna the night I knocked on your door in February. I turned around. She looked at me with the expression of a person making a confession they have been sitting on for a long time and are somewhat relieved to put down. I had enough lasagna, she said. I was lonely and I wanted to talk to someone and I had noticed you through the walls enough to want to know if you were interesting in person. I said through the walls. You have a very good speaking voice, and the walls in this building are not thick, and you make phone calls in your kitchen sometimes, and I could hear you explaining things to people through the wall in a way that made you sound very calm and competent, and I was curious. I stared at her. You could have just knocked, I said. The lasagna gave me a reason. You didn't need a reason. She tilted her head. I know that now. I turned back to the eggs, moved them around the pan, put them on a plate and handed her the plate because she ate off of mine anyway and we had stopped performing separate meals some weeks ago. She took a bite. I said I heard you through the walls too. She looked up. You grade papers out loud sometimes, you narrate the bad ones. I was walking past my kitchen wall one night and I heard you say this is not what a thesis statement is for, and I laughed for about 45 seconds. I leaned against the counter across from her. That was March. She stared at me. March. You were very passionate about the thesis statement. She covered her face with one hand. Oh no. It was my favorite thing that happened all week. She lowered her hand, her eyes were bright. You were listening. Thin walls. You were listening. I was a willing participant in the auditory situation, yes. She looked at me for a moment longer, then she said very quietly, I like this. Eating eggs on a Saturday. All of it. She looked down at the plate, then back up. I like that we knew each other before we knew each other. I like that I didn't have to audition. She paused. I like that the lasagna was also a pretext and you had already gone back to the mailboxes and we were both being slightly ridiculous for 8 months and we got here anyway. I said we're still being slightly ridiculous. Ongoing project, she smiled. I think it suits us. I crossed the kitchen and she looked up at me from the counter like she always did, like she was deciding something she had already decided, and I kissed her in a way that was entirely unhurried and had nothing to prove. When she pulled back, she said, the eggs are getting cold. I said, you care about that. She considered, not really. We ate them cold anyway, and neither of us minded. 6 months later, Kara knocked on my door. No casserole dish, no oven mitts, just her in a sweater with the look she wore when she was going to say something she had been thinking about for a while. I opened the door wider. She came inside and sat on the couch and said, my lease is up in February. I sat on the other side of the couch. I know you mentioned it. I've been looking at the numbers. Okay. Splitting rent between 2 apartments in the same building that we spend approximately 60% of our time moving between is not efficient. I looked at her. That, she said carefully, is your kind of argument. I'm giving it back to you, see how it feels. I said, Kara. Yes. Are you asking to move in or are you telling me to ask you? She thought about it for a long, serious moment. Option B, she said finally, historically the asking goes better when you do it. I moved across the couch. She turned toward me. There was something in her face that was doing the thing it did when she had rehearsed something and the real moment had turned out better than the rehearsal, and she was trying to hold both feelings at once. I said, I'd like you to move in. She said, I'd like that too. February. February, she agreed, then she leaned in and kissed me quick and certain. When she sat back, she said, I am not responsible for what happens if your 4 meals clash with my cooking rotation. I expanded the rotation. I know, I've been watching. Thin walls, I said. She laughed, the real one, the one that surprised her even now sometimes. The building made its evening sounds around us. 3rd floor, 3A, soon just 3rd floor. The elevator in February, the lasagna, the letter about Derek, midnight in a hallway, 2 coffee cups on a counter, everything after. She settled into my side like she belonged there, which she did, which she had been doing for 8 months before either of us said it out loud. I kept waiting for something to feel new. It all just felt like arriving somewhere I had been trying to find for a long time and not knowing that was what I was doing. That's the thing about the right person. Sometimes they live 6 feet down the hall and it still takes a party and a rainy Thursday elevator and a casserole dish full of a very transparent pretext before you get out of your own way long enough to notice the door was never locked to begin with. What would you do if you found out the person you had been quietly noticing for months had been quietly noticing you back the whole time? Have you ever had a moment where you realized something had already been true for much longer than you had let yourself believe? Tell me in the comments. If this one meant something to you, leave a like, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.